You're not overwhelmed because you're disorganized. You're overwhelmed because now, as you've scaled, every new commitment interacts with something that already exists. Most experienced leaders, they're not stalling because their opportunities dry up. They stall because the opportunities multiply. I'm not talking about bad opportunities. I'm talking about respectable, they're credible, well-intentioned opportunities. They show up as introductions, right? Invitations, those side conversations, advisory type asks, like quick calls and, hey, I thought of you type messages. At a certain level, opportunities, they stop arriving as a problem to solve or some huge win to gain. And they start arriving as volume to manage. And that's where things quietly start to break. In this episode, I want to walk you through why choice itself starts to drain even the highest performers, even when they're surrounded by good options, and why trying to optimize decision-making, it usually makes the problem worse. More importantly, I'm going to show you how strong leaders rebuild decision quality by changing what earns consideration in the first place, not by going through some type of internal mental gymnastics, trying to debate every option better. By the end of this episode, you're going to have a clear way to evaluate opportunities that protects your judgment, your leverage, and the version of leadership that you're actually growing into. If you've been listening to this show for a while, and if you haven't, make sure you hit the subscribe button. But if you know the show, you know I've spent years sitting inside real decision rooms with founders, executives, and operators who are well past survival mode. I've watched people scale companies, exit businesses, re-enter markets, and then quietly they get stuck. Not because they lacked ambition. It's not like they just got fat and lazy, but because the rules they used to make choices with, they stopped working at the level that they're at now. And what we're talking about today is exactly what shows up when success changes the physics of decision making. Here's how we're going to walk through this. I'm going to explain why opportunity eventually starts degrading decision quality instead of improving it. Then I'm going to break down what actually goes wrong when leaders treat every opportunity like a conversation that's worth having. From there, we're going to talk about what strong filters actually protect, not just your time or your focus, but the role you keep reinforcing every time you say yes. Most leaders, they don't realize that they're paying an identity cost with their decisions until they're stuck playing a version of the job that they've already outgrown. And finally, here's where this stops being abstract, right? Because the shift, it doesn't happen when you get better at evaluating opportunities. It happens when you change what earns evaluation at all. Let me start with a pattern that I see all the time. Early on, you say, yes, because that's how you figure things out, right? You don't yet have enough context to be selective, and you don't need to be. So most decisions, they don't collide with many others. So, even when something isn't the right move, it's not like it creates a lot of drag. So you move on. Let's say you make the wrong decision. You move on, you adjust, you just keep going. And at that stage, progress comes from being in motion, not from carefully screening every option. Now fast forward 5, 10, or 15 years. Your calendar's full. Your network's deep. Your inbox never seems to clear. The work starts to feel heavier than it should. You're not overwhelmed because you're disorganized. You're overwhelmed because now, as you've scaled, every new commitment interacts with something that already exists. This is the key moment that I see a lot of leaders misdiagnose. They think the problem is efficiency. They think the answer is delegation. They think they need better, time blocking or tighter meetings. But that's not what's changed. What changes is that opportunities stop stacking neatly on top of each other. Every new yes now affects several things that already exist. It pulls time, attention, and follow through away from commitments that you've already made. You're no longer just adding something. You're redistributing effort. And at this stage, you don't bounce back the way you used to. Energy becomes something you spend deliberately, not something that just resets overnight. So your focus turns into a real constraint, not a mindset issue. And yet most leaders, they keep evaluating opportunities as if they exist independently. That's the crack that everything falls through. So let's talk about why opportunity starts to degrade decision quality. We have to understand the why. Here's what this actually looks like in real businesses. A founder gets introduced to a potential, say, advisory role. It's a light lift, couple calls a month, some equity upside, maybe a smart team. And around the same time, a vendor pitches a partnership that could expand distribution. Then a peer asks for help evaluating an acquisition. None of these are bad ideas. In fact, 10 years ago, saying yes to any one of them probably would have been a very smart move. The problem is that each one now has to be evaluated in context with everything else that's already on the plate. The founder isn't asking, is this good? They're asking, is this good enough to justify what it displaces? And because there's no pre-decided standard, they end up running the same internal math every time. How much time will this really take? What happens if it grows? What am I giving up if I say yes? Could this turn into something strategic later? None of those questions are wrong. The issue is that they're being answered from scratch every time a new opportunity emerges. There's no rule that ends the conversation early. So judgment gets used, where a filter should have done the work. And that's where decision fatigue comes from at this level. Not from volume of work, I guess rebuilding the same decision logic under slightly different circumstances, right? So a strong filter changes this immediately. Instead of debating upside, you're checking fit. Instead of exploring possibility, you're enforcing a standard. I want to give you an example. Does this opportunity directly reinforce one of the three outcomes I'm already committed to this year? Does it reduce complexity somewhere else? Or does it add a new surface that I'm going to have to manage or somebody on my team is going to have to manage? Does it move me further into the role I'm trying to scale into or pull me back into an old one I'm trying to exit? Most opportunities fail these tests quickly, not because they're bad, but because they don't belong now. That's how judgment gets preserved. You stop burning energy, trying to decide how to decide, and you reserve real thinking for the few situations that genuinely deserve it. Over time, that's the difference between leaders who feel constantly taxed by choice and leaders whose decisions, still compound, even as the business gets more complex. There's a cost of treating every opportunity with, an internal debate. And here's how this usually shows up in the real world. A leader takes the meeting because it feels easier than declining it. They tell themselves there's no harm in listening because, hey, I'm just gathering information and you never know which meeting could turn into something big. You're not making any type of commitment yet. So obviously there's no downside yet, right? So they sit back on the call, they skim the deck, they ask a few smart questions and say they'll think about it. Then the follow-ups, a second conversation to clarify scope, a third to talk, about timing, an internal discussion about whether it fits right now. None of this feels like a decision, but all of it consumes attention. The opportunity hasn't earned a yes, but it hasn't earned, a no either. So it just lingers. And because there's no clear filter, it keeps resurfacing. Multiply that by 5 or 10 active possibilities, and something subtle starts to happen. You're no longer deciding. You're just maintaining optionality. Your calendar starts filling with conversations that don't move anything forward, and your mental bandwidth gets eaten up by things that never quite become real. Execution starts to slow, not because you're overloaded with work, but because your attention is spread across too many unresolved decisions. This is where leaders start confusing, openness with flexibility. Staying available, it feels responsible, especially when past success came from being responsive and accessible. But without a standard that shuts conversations down early, judgments just ends up doing work it shouldn't be doing. You're constantly reevaluating instead of committing. And over time, that creates drag that the business can't see on a dashboard. Eventually, decisions, they stop being intentional, right? The most recent conversation, the loud squeaky wheel carries more weight than it should. The opportunity that's easiest to say yes to always wins, not because it fits best, but because declining it would require more explanation than agreeing. That's not a failure of discipline. It's what happens when every opportunity is treated as a discussion instead of being screened against a clear rule. Strong filters change this dynamic completely. They don't make you closed off. They make you decisive. Most opportunities never turn into conversations because they don't meet the criteria to deserve one. And the few that do get attention actually move forward instead of, just hanging around as mental clutter. So let's talk about what the right filters actually protect. Because most leaders, they assume filters are about protecting time. They're not. Time is the most obvious benefit, but it's not the most important one. The real protection, that shows up in what your role slowly turns into when decisions aren't screened carefully. I want to play this out for you. A founder keeps stepping into situations because in their mind, they're the most capable. They know the deal structure. They understand the customer. They can spot the risk faster than anyone else in the room. Sound familiar? So when something feels uncertain, they get pulled in every time. When a decision feels important, it comes to them. When an opportunity needs credibility, their name gets attached. Each of those moments makes sense on its own, but taken together, they quietly define the job. The business starts treating that leader as the default problem solver instead of the architect. The founders, their calendar, right? They fill with reviews, exceptions, edge cases, not because they want control, but because past decisions train the organization on who handles what. That's the identity cost that most leaders miss. Filters, they don't just decide which opportunities you take. They teach the business who you are available to be. Every yes reinforces a role. Every no forces clarity elsewhere. Without filters, you keep getting pulled back into versions of the job you were supposed to be growing out of. It's all about transformation. This is why two leaders with the same resources can feel completely different levels of pressure. One is spending time reinforcing a role they've already outgrown. The other has filters, that push decisions down, narrow involvement, and they force the organization to adapt around a clearer standard. Strong filters, they protect your leverage. They do this by keeping your involvement aligned with where the business is actually headed. They protect judgment by reducing how often you're dragged into exceptions, right? And they protect identity by preventing the slow drift that comes back, right, into patterns that once created value, but now they limit scale. Most leaders, they don't notice this erosion until it's expensive to unwind. The longer you wait, the more expensive it gets. They wake up with this full calendar and a capable team, but the role feels heavier than it should. Not because the business failed to grow, but because their decisions train the business in the wrong direction. Filters, they don't just make choices easier. They shape the business around the leader that you're trying to become, not the one you already were. Once you see that, another pattern becomes hard to ignore. Even when leaders protect, their role better, they still fall into a different trap. They point to results and assume progress. Work keeps moving, right? Nothing's obviously broken. You can point to activity and results without stretching. On paper, it looks like things are exactly the way you want them. But if you step back, those results, they don't really stack. They don't make the business cleaner or simpler to run. They don't change how decisions get made next time. You're producing outcomes, but momentum's not building. That's where the difference between accumulating results and actually moving the business forward starts to show up. And I call this outcome thinking versus outcome accumulation. And it's where a lot of experienced leaders, they get fooled by their own scoreboard. Here's what that actually looks like. The leader agrees to speak at an event because it's great exposure. They join an advisory board, maybe because the people are really sharp. They want the association. They want to get to know these people. And they greenlight a side initiative because it might open a door later. Each decision produces something measurable, a new relationship, maybe a revenue bump, another line on the resume, right? Individually, these outcomes, they feel justified. Collectively, they don't change the direction. The work gets busier without becoming more focused. Effort starts to increase, but the leverage doesn't. You end up managing a growing list of wins. They don't actually make the next decision any easier. Nothing's compounding. Everything just adds. That's outcome accumulation. Outcome thinking, that works differently, right? Instead of asking whether an opportunity produces a result, you ask whether it strengthens a trajectory. Does this make future decisions simpler or more complex? Does it reduce the number of things that you have to personally manage? Or does it add another thread that needs attention? Does it reinforce the direction that you've already committed to? Or is it quietly going to pull you sideways? Leaders who operate this way, they turn down plenty of good opportunities, not because they lack ambition, but because the outcomes don't reinforce anything that already exists. The work would produce activity, right? Maybe even results, but it wouldn't simplify the business or make the next decision easier. It would just add another thread to manage. This is why two leaders, similar success levels, they can feel different levels of, let's say, strain. One is accumulating outcomes and wondering why nothing feels lighter. The other is selecting for outcomes that stack on top of each other and simplify the system over time. Strong filters force this distinction. They make it hard to say yes to things that look productive, but don't move the business anywhere specific. They pressure every opportunity to answer a harder question. If this works exactly as promised, what does it actually change about how we operate next year? If the answer is not much, it may still be a good opportunity. It's just not the right one. And even when leaders start choosing the right opportunities, things can still feel tighter than they should. That's usually not because they chose wrong, but because they maybe underestimated what the business could actually carry at the same time.
If this episode is hitting home, you're probably already asking where this kind of thinking actually happens. That is exactly what Me Plus Ultra sessions are built for. They're small, virtual, structured working sessions for experienced business leaders and leaders. Each month includes breakthrough sessions, process sessions, and expert forums. And each one has a very specific purpose. In a session, one leader brings a real challenge or decision they're facing. The room starts by slowing the thinking down, asking clarifying questions, challenging assumptions, and making sure everyone is actually solving the right problem. From there, members are sharing insights, their experiences, and they're giving advice, but it's grounded, relevant, and it's built on what's actually already been pressure tested. If you've been in rooms where advice comes fast, but clarity never sticks, this is a different standard. You can request access right now at meplusultra.com/sessions. Once again, go to meplusultra.com/sessions.
Constant awareness is where otherwise good decision-making starts to fail. Leaders, they don't misjudge this because they're reckless. They misjudge it because they're evaluating capacity in pieces instead of as a system. They look at new initiatives and think, oh, we can handle this, without accounting all the other things that are already drawing attention and judgment and follow through at the same time. I want you to picture this, right? A new opportunity comes in that clearly fits the direction. The people are solid. It pencils well. What doesn't get surfaced in that decision-making moment is what it competes with. Not on paper, but in reality. The decisions it delays, the conversations it pushes off, the margin it quietly erodes across work that's steady or already, I should say, in motion. Nothing breaks immediately, but that's what makes this more dangerous. Instead, pressure shows up indirectly. Response times start to slow. Meetings start to stack. The quality bar slips just enough to notice, but not enough to trigger alarms. So leaders find themselves back in details that they thought they moved past. Not because something went wrong, but because the system is carrying more than it can metabolize cleanly. Does that make sense? Constraint-aware leaders, they evaluate differently. They don't ask whether something's doable. They ask what it displaces, what attention it pulls from, what decisions it crowds out. They understand that capacity, it's not just a head count or time on a calendar. It's cognitive load, decision density and recovery space between demands. This is where strong filters earn their keep. They don't just protect your direction. They protect the business from accumulating strain that never looks like a bad decision in isolation. It eventually shows up as slower execution, diluted focus, right? And leaders getting pulled back into the work that they should no longer be doing. Constraint awareness, it's not about lowering your ambition. It's about recognizing that even the right opportunities, when they're stacked too closely together, they'll eventually weaken the outcomes they were meant to support. None of this fails because leaders don't understand it. It fails because understanding alone doesn't hold up once real decisions start stacking. This is where most of the advice that's out there falls short. I can explain filters clearly. I can walk you through examples. You can even agree with every point intellectually. The next opportunity lands. The context feels different. The rules quietly bend. Not because you forgot them, but because habits formed under success, they're hard to override in the moment. So if you want to know what actually changes behavior, which is what's going to ultimately help you, you need to be in a room where another experienced operator shuts something down quickly. No long explanation, no hedging, no need to justify the decision. The opportunity's not bad, just doesn't belong. The conversation moves on without drama. That moment does more when you witness it than any checklist ever could. You see what didn't require debate. You see how little emotional energy, was spent, and you notice that nothing negative followed the decision. No relationships were burned. No doors were slammed shut. Just clarity enforced calmly. When you witness it, that observation, it recalibrates standards. It shows you what strong filters look like in use, not in theory, right? You start recognizing how often you've been negotiating with yourself unnecessarily. You notice how much airtime you've been given to things that never should have made it past the first screen. This is why leaders who spend time around peers with strong decision discipline, they sharpen so quickly. Not because they're getting better advice, but because they're watching how decisions are actually handled when stakes are real. They see where conversations stop. They see what doesn't get entertained, and they absorb those standards without having to intellectualize them. Advice explains what to do. Observation resets what feels normal. It's the best way to say it. Once your baseline shifts, decisions, they just resolve faster. The internal debate that you constantly go through, it just shortens. You stop feeling the need to keep options alive just in case. Not because you've become rigid, but because you've seen what clean judgment looks like when it's practiced consistently. That's also why filters erode in isolation. Without exposure to how other experienced leaders apply pressure to decisions, it's easy to drift back into old habits. Context starts winning again and standards start to soften without anybody noticing it. Strong environments make decision standards visible. You don't just hear what good judgment sounds like. You see where conversations stop, what never gets entertained, and how little energy gets wasted explaining decisions that don't belong. That exposure resets what feels normal. Over time, it shortens internal debate and restores decision quality in a way reading, or advice, it doesn't stand a chance. It never does. Once that standard's clear, the work changes. The question's no longer how to find better opportunities. It's how to protect the discipline that keeps the wrong ones from taking up space. At a certain level, progress doesn't come from expanding what you consider. It comes from enforcing what qualifies. I want to be very clear here. That shift isn't about being closed off. It's about being deliberate. Decisions resolve faster because fewer things earn attention in the first place. Effort compounds because commitments reinforce each other instead of competing. The role you play stabilizes around where the business is headed, not around habits that used to work. If your calendar is full, but the business still feels harder, to move than it should, the issue usually isn't effort or opportunity. It's that too many decisions are being made without a shared standard for what really matters. And that's the part most leaders, they can't reinforce on their own. This kind of discipline, it doesn't form in open forums or fast-moving group calls. It develops in smaller rooms with experienced operators where decisions are slowed down, and the standards are visible in real time. That's what Me Plus Ultra sessions, it's why we build them. They're small, they're private, they're structured working sessions for focused business owners and leaders. Each of these sessions centers on a real decision or a challenge that's brought into the room. Assumptions get pressed, constraints get surfaced, and filters get sharpened before advice ever enters the conversation. This isn't for people looking for ideas. It's for leaders they already have momentum and they just want cleaner judgment because the stakes are increasing. Access to this is limited and participation is by request. You can learn more and witness it firsthand at meplusultra.com/sessions. I want you to visit it now. We'll see you in the room if it's the right fit. Cheers, everyone.